Hello and welcome to another episode of the CollabTalk podcast, where we discuss the convergence of technology, business productivity, and collaboration culture. My guest today is Dominik Wittenbeck. Hey, Dominik. Good to see you.
Thank you very much, Christian, for having me here.
And Dominik is the group CTO at SNP, a leader in digital transformation, and he specializes in SAP migrations and enterprise modernization, and I guess digital transformation. We'll throw other words on top of there. Great topic today. We're talking about why interoperability is about more than just technology. So welcome, Dominik.
Well, thanks again for having me, Christian, here. So for myself, I'm as you said, group CTO at SNP, and I mean you perfectly described for what we actually do. We are in SAP-centric data migrations, right? So we basically used to call ourselves the transformation company, basically, because most of what we do has to do with moving enterprise data from A to B. And the question is now, like, how does this intersect with interoperability, really? But before we dive into the topic, let me give you my spin on what interoperability actually means by like what you're actually trying to achieve with interoperability ultimately, right?
Yep.
So interoperability really is like getting a holistic view of your enterprise, of all of your processes, right? About all of your systems to really streamline the operations that you're trying to do. So everything that is in the way of you getting clarity and transparency over the processes, being able to act on the system is basically what you get out of when you talk about interoperability. And it has many levels, right? It has levels of how end users interact with the software or how little they have to actually interact with the software. It is how systems do interact with each other. And the spin that we typically take on interoperability is that we lay the ground for these things. And what I mean with this is basically many of the projects that we do on top of the software that we have is actually doing system consolidations, system modernizations, basically getting a system landscape, which over the time, you know it best, right? Gets ugly because, I mean, you lose track of things, right? You make things complicated because the business and the way of how it basically comes up with new requirements just makes it so. So from time to time, many big corporations where you think like, okay, now there is maybe a good a point in time where we, for instance, want to migrate from ECC to S4. We have to even migrate from ECC to S4. So we need to modernize our landscape. Hey, why don't we use this occasion to actually, slap like multiple flies with one slap actually here, and do a system consolidation along the way. Increase the transparency on our business processes. Harmonize our master data to be more streamlined in the future, and with that, actually like setting the ground for good interoperability with your people and within your future system landscape. So you're ready basically for the next round of people throwing in new requirements, stuff gets messy again, and then eventually you come back to exactly doing that again and consolidating.
I was going to say that I talk all the time about governance and the governance bodies, and I like every day I have conversations with clients, with partners, with other experts that are out there around there. Very few organizations in my career have I run into that have like a strong and robust working governance and change management model where they are constantly reviewing, looking at business changes, the technology changes, the updates, and what do we need to go and do. So it's almost like it's like a running start to everything that you just described, versus you're focusing more on the business than the tools that you're using to run the business. You add things on. It's like Band-Aid and Band-Aid and Band-Aid. And then finally, you have to go outside to experts to come in and say, help us organize this, get this straight. I mean, do you see common threads of mistakes that companies make around, interoperability and adaptability of these various technologies? Things that companies could, if they put these practices in place, could do a better job when the change happens.
Yeah, I mean, change always is hurting most when it's accumulating, right? Because you have to push your whole organization typically through the thing. So if you make it a daily practice, basically, or a regular practice, basically, to revisit the landscape and basically look at like, how actually you are progressing, how stuff is basically laid out, how many interfaces do you actually have, how many systems do you have accumulated? I mean, you did an M&A, you didn't integrate completely, right? Systems are sticking around, stuff like that. It accumulates over time. So if you're evolving a practice of continuously, and I mean, that's basically the governance, right, that you want to build around this, and get transparency over where you currently stand, you know when there is actually a tipping point of when now you really need to do something. Of course, continuously doing something is good, but if it comes to larger changes, which also inflict, like, I don't know, a business impact, like downtimes, for instance, when you need to
Yeah.
migrate systems, you want to also like keep this on the lower end of things, right? So there's only so much that you can really do continuously in terms of reshaping the system landscapes, that you probably need to go through some iterative process. I think the best practice that you can probably have is like get a good clarity, so get a system in place that actually helps you with the governance, so you know exactly like, okay, I'm making a compromise right here on my landscape and on the interoperability that it brings to me. I'm willing to give in for right now, but I know, hey, I can stage this into the next project of overhaul that I'm doing anyhow, and you know exactly then how big this is. I know it's not something that is easy to do. It sounds easier than that it actually is, but building this type of practice of continuously, basically, getting transparency and rolling in those projects, I think is helping to avoid the bigger change that accumulates basically over time. For instance, in my industry right now, of us SAP being SAP centric, I don't know, SAP has put out S4 as the next generation of enterprise software, I don't know, like 12 years ago by now, or something like that, 10 by the least, right? And many customers did not yet adopt. Why didn't they adopt? They didn't adopt because the change was just so fearsome. They had this big old, not old, but they had this big shaped ERP system catered to their needs, customized out to the end to really fulfill the processes and give them competitive advantage. Moving that back into complete standard sounds super scary, right? Because you are at a chance of risking your risking the people actually following you, because of you might be losing that. Then on the other side, you wait and you wait and you wait, and more changes actually accumulating. So,
Yeah.
which makes it even more frightening. And then in the end, what many times actually is happening is like, oh damn, we didn't make this decision for so long of a time. Please, IT, go ahead and just do it for us.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, many of the things really don't are just not IT projects in the end. They really are business projects, because it's always about how are my business processes right now? How do I want to define my business processes in the future? So there's no way that IT can make a sole decision on the whole thing of such a large project without involving the business. And the more stacked the business gets with like requirements that they need to like make decisions on and need to cap in the project, the worse, right? Because
Right.
the longer it takes, the more impact it has on their daily work, right? The longer the downtimes and so on are going to be. So making stuff a little bit more condensed, and basically cutting it shorter, actually makes a lot of sense.
I mean, it's so. I mean, look, I lived in that world for years and years. So I completely understand. I mean, as I started my career, really the biggest company, working for the phone company and doing integration and roll out these applications, because it's not just the buildup of the requirements around the change. You also have, because you get in this interesting place where there's all of these new features and new capabilities, which your end users aren't even thinking about yet, because they don't have that. So they're locked into the new or more requirements on the old system, and then they get a taste of the new technology, what can do, and then it explodes with even more requirements and asks and change and things that happen. It's one of the reasons why I think over the last really 30 years you saw the growth, the expansion of all of the agile methodologies, but the basic idea is smaller amounts of change, but more frequently, so that you
Yeah,
learn from it,
yeah,
adjust, and go forward. But to
absolutely.
do that, again, it goes back to like that change model, that governance model of how often are we reviewing this? And I often say that organizations that make change management part of their culture, so it's just the way that they operate, the way that they think, are at a distinct competitive advantage over everyone that then struggles with those things. It doesn't mean that it's any easier for them, that they've just said like, hey, we're going to do this, and we've built it into our culture, into the way that we operate.
Yeah, but it's just like when you're working out, right? If you're in the flow and if you're continuously working out, it becomes part of your daily practice, then it doesn't hurt as much because you're just used to how it basically works, right? You're used to how the mechanics basically work. You're used to know, you know, like who are the people that I need to like introduce to new things, like who are my spokespersons, who are my champions within the company that I can leverage, that are multipliers, right? Within the company that I can use for exactly that. And in regards to the iterative process, basically, many of the customers that we see nowadays, they don't like to go big bang. Specifically, large corporations don't like to go big bang. They don't want to like put everything on one plate and basically like shove it through and hope for the
Right.
best that it actually works in the end,
Right.
right? If it does, it's actually quite good. But most of the times, they fear the risk for exactly the reasons that you said, Christian. That um, there's so much new stuff that is typically rolled out, the more change you basically accumulated in the next release, let's say, for instance, right? That your operation, your organization can't cope with that. So they're choosing typically wave-based rollouts where they try with a smaller country first, try to bring some complexity in, hope always for the best that, hey, we build a template up front, right? Which
Yeah.
is then serving the purpose of being the standard for the future. Turns out in wave two, typically, oh, we forgot a couple of things, right? Maybe the choice was good. And as you said, if these corporations are good in practice with these specific processes, they know how to make the rollout in terms of what is the right entity to start with, because it brings like the level of complexity in that doesn't kill me in the first go, but it also has enough of that core processes in already that I don't need to redesign it every round again and
Right.
again and again,
Well,
right?
that's always the mistake with like doing a pilot. If a lot of organizations think, oh, we'll take some out of the way project or this other system, whatever, that's not business critical, and we'll pilot on that. But then you don't learn really the
Exactly.
constraints of like the system and run into. I mean,
It's
the
not,
way that
yeah, it's not representative. It's just
right.
not representative of what you're trying to achieve longer way, which is exactly why you need to make a choice. And that's not so easy to do, right? You need to make a choice between the complexity that I would roughly say, like, hey, you need to meet at least 80% of the complexity in the first project, but choose an entity basically that is not as large that if it fails, it crushes your complete business,
Is
basically.
this? Would you see this as this is like the biggest uh, um, challenge that customers have? Is that they try to put too much on the plate for that one time, or they're not breaking it up. They're not thinking enough about which are the right business units, how we go and do this for the rollout. I mean, what are what are the biggest challenges that you see that clients have?
From my personal experience, it is not exactly that. It's intransparency, things that you don't see that then basically you stumble over across the way. So it's connected actually, because I mean you want to make the choice of that first entity that you basically move, or that you basically migrate, or whatever change you want to basically do it, and make the right choice there. But if you don't have the transparency about like what is that entity actually doing, what did they accumulate across the last time that I
Yeah.
did this, basically that is where the mistakes happen, because you think like, hey, I did this for like the last 20 years of my career. I know exactly who to talk to. And then, oh, things
Yeah, yeah.
changed over sudden.
Well,
So
no,
you have to reassess.
there's a whole category of, I mean, we get into like shadow IT. It's when you go in and you do that discovery process. Again, this is my experience, whether I was in the IT organization in the company, and you go and you do, in fact, when Office 365 rolled out, I was at Microsoft. I was part of that team that rolled us out. The gentleman that owned all of the servers that the service was sitting on a regular basis, and he would go out and he would say like, "All right, we have thousands of servers. It's like there's like 500 of these servers. Like we don't know what's on it." We do the discovery, we do the surveys, we find out some information, and then there's these 500 that still like don't know what's on it. So then he has like a step-by-step process he would go through, where he would remove permissions from all of the non-responsive
See
owners,
what breaks, basically.
and a certain number of people would come forward like, hey, what happened, and stuff like, okay, you didn't answer the other emails for months. We're not talking about days, folks,
Yeah,
months of
yeah,
reaching out to do that.
yeah.
And then the next step is to shut the servers off, and then a percentage of them like freak out and all this kind of stuff. And then if no response months later, again, they were very careful with this, but there's still like 300 servers that no one ever responded. They turned it off, they removed permissions, so they then wipe them, they repurpose, like if there's data they'd archive, but it's a painful cold storage archive, and then you get a certain percentage of people that'd be like, hey, what happened? And you're like, 6 months we've been working on this. So my point here is that no matter how much during that discovery process, how much you do outreach to your end users, to the business users, the teams to get things, there's always going to be things that then trip you up that weren't identified, that come in that you didn't classify, that causes problems as part of that. But if you
Absolutely.
have that process, if you've got that governance, that change management model in place, it like that's kind of built into that, the discussion. All right, we've now identified it. Here's where we are.
It's a method. It's a methodology rather than like a big thing that you're basically trying to do, because it just becomes your living and breathing basically along the way.
Yeah.
I do have another example where this like kind of also shows, but from a different aspect right now. So some of the projects that we actually do are not just SAP to SAP; they are non-SAP to SAP. And when you're a little bit familiar with SAP, I mean, it's a German-based system. Many of the acronyms that are in there are still German-related. I never understand how anybody outside of Germany gets that, basically. But it's a very stringent system. It's a very constrained system. And if you look at one SAP system to another SAP system, yes, they of course are differently customized and how the process is basically run, but you can still, from like where the data resides in, very much tell where is my purchase orders, how many of those do I have, in which organizations do I use them, where are my requisitions, where are my invoices, and so on and so forth. It becomes much more, I'd say problematic, challenging when you go to non-SAP, specifically homegrown systems. So basically somebody spun up as part of some side project, basically to improve a process, and then maybe that person even left the company, right? And so your sole resource that you were depending on is basically left. So you also have to like develop techniques like the ones you said, like in collaboration right here, but also like from a technology perspective, you have to develop techniques of how to introspect those systems, specifically when you are in the needs of moving data out of those systems in a selective way. With like a wave-based migration comes naturally. You want to move this one entity. Oh, great. Those 5 entities are using this one system. So what is actually the data that's belonging to this one entity? And what are the processes that they are using? Whom do I actually need to talk to actually map it out to my target infrastructure? Where do I want to bring this? Super important at this point to like get to the customer here and get into collaboration to get the understanding, because despite the fact that there are techniques how to introspect those systems, like for instance you look at the data model, you do aggregations and stats and basically look at how the data model is basically defined. You find, for instance, header tables, which are representative for different objects. You lay them out into something like a business object catalog, right? Which actually is like the only thing that you can then do and take to the business. What's even more important, like get the people at hand that have somewhat remote knowledge of the system to actually talk this through and challenge this in the end, because otherwise you will be taking false assumptions most of the time, and what you're ending up with is basically you're trying to move data from one system to the other, finding out that the processes don't even match to each other, right? Never mind meeting the expectations that you initially set. So it's really utmost important to like get grip of the right people if they're still in the organization, right? If they're not, right, you have to be a little bit intelligent about like the procedure of how you discover in those systems, how you identify like what data is really in there, how to group and classify them to make it digestible in a discussion with a customer, right? Who from a procedural perspective, from a process perspective, knows what they are doing, right? But they don't know how the stuff is being laid out in the systems. So yes, that's also of utmost importance.
Yeah, I mean, this just reminds me, it's taken me back to the discussions around this of helping organizations to think of making themselves more modular. So it's like what you just described is that, this business unit, this team, here's the tools, here's the inputs, here's the outputs. It's like you're creating organizationally like a service bus, like no matter how your system, your tools communicate, we'll make sure it matches up with where it needs to go based on what those requirements are. Rather than, I mean, you can't look at a company as a monolithic system. I mean, it goes back to like trying to do a data migration, let's all do it, and we'll do it over the weekend. In the information management systems, that never worked for anyone, Maybe if you're a tiny company with a dozen people and you've got a few hundred gig of data, it's like you're right. But when you're talking about terabytes, petabytes of data, complex systems, all the connectors, like all of the things in very different systems that share commonalities of data around it. Again, very complex, very quickly. You cannot treat all of it the same.
No, no. I mean, that's one of the like. I mean, monoliths, in a sense, had an appeal, right? Because I mean, it's all a fully integrated system if you use it this way, right? But
Right.
then if you want to like upgrade parts of it or you want to exchange something with that, good luck with that, right? Which is like why a composable enterprise is on the forefront these days of where you basically decompose it, like you said, in different services that you basically connect through a bus that then can interact and are interchangeable much more easily and decomposable much more easily than the monolith basically was in the past. And that's a trend that we see basically striving, right? I mean, of course, it's been fired up by like the cloud applications and so on and so forth. So everybody in SAP, and that's really a slowly and sometimes backwards facing like type of like industry that we're having there, looking pretty much at a monolith. But we see much more that they are trying to basically disassemble this and bring it into many more different, let's say, islands that are then basically connected loosely, that the interchangeability and the independence, the independent of the life cycle of that particular, let's say, unit or process or module is basically preserved for the future.
Right.
Of course, that brings other complexities to it, right? So, like you said, when everything is like intertangled and you like want to pull one string and you don't have a good level of abstraction built into the whole process of how you build that infrastructure and how you basically set up the services, then you're basically ending up with the same mess. You're pulling it like one dot and you have like the whole thing basically attached completely to it. So
Right.
you need to take, of course, look into like opportunities for standardization for human using common protocols and stuff like that, building common data models even that span across systems, right? Which then give you a unified view, let's say, on your business data, making it more flexible to move from one system to another system over time without wrecking the whole thing altogether.
Right. Yeah. Again, bringing back memories. It's been like I was in that space working with high-tech manufacturing organizations, and the idea was, kind of at the start of SaaS applications. So back in the early 2000s, all this stuff was still brand new, and trying to get as close to real-time view of like the manufacturing process. Man, it's very complex stuff, and there were still a lot of even I worked for a company at the startup phase of a company called E2Open. I don't know if you ever
Mhm.
ran into them, but some of what we were trying to do. But you're right, we were trying to standardize so that everything was, XML based communication across these various systems, and when it's all brand new. And um, but it comes back to like the people, the conversations, with these organizations, and trying to get everyone to talk together, to be, you talk about transparency, to talk about what they're trying to do, what their expected outcome of these things are. It's not just the IT side. Like with the failures, the struggles that we had were on like the people side, to get them to come together and do it in a regular fashion. Again,
Yeah, and also get acceptance and buy-in from the people,
right.
right? For the change that is happening. And I mean, from my personal experience as a leader, like getting the buy-in of people is making them part of the solution. Have them have their say in this. Have them have their place. Don't put something on top of those guys, basically, because in the end it will backfire. It will backfire with you, right?
Yeah.
So you may need to make like a, I would say like it's not full democracy, right? And not everybody can like make a decision.
Somebody has to make a decision.
Right,
But
right.
if,
But
if
have people have their say, bring up their opinion, specifically the ones which are your key users, which are basically your champions, basically in the organization, and basically with that, let them foster an environment where they can shape a common alignment and agreement that in the end carries forward the whole decision,
right.
basically in the end, and backs you up with the decision that you have to make in the end.
Well, right, because that's part of that too. Is that if people trust the process, the methodology, like the discussion, it doesn't mean that everything that I was pushing for, like I'm going to get, but if I'm confident that, look, there was a discussion, I was asking for this, you gave me something over here, it gives me 60-70% of what I want, but here's why. If you have that discussion, I'm much more accepting of that than it goes into a black box. I have no idea about whether it was even considered my request
Yes.
out of that.
Yes. It's about transparency and mutual understanding of the requirements that other people have, right? I mean, typically people um, don't agree with stuff that they don't understand, right? This is also like how many of the political situations basically come into place because there's just no transparency. People don't understand why the decision has been made this way. And of course, you can start explaining, and many times you actually need to do so. But if you make people parts of the decision, right? We have a saying at SNP is like disagree but commit. We can discuss,
Right.
right? But in
Yeah.
the end, it's about making a common agreement. And even if you're not like that's not my opinion. You still disagree, but you commit. And if
Right.
you give the like, if you have practice with that, if you like give the employees and the people a feeling of being heard and they taking being serious, then likelihood of those things succeeding are much more likely, especially on the long run. Because I mean, you might get short-term gains and may even be successful on the short term, but then longer term, things start to degrade basically again because people are derailing processes that you set up because hey, they weren't part of the decision.
Right.
They just don't like it. No, they don't like it. They don't even understand it. So why should you do it this way? And then basically stuff gets derailed. So in order to be sustainable here with the decisions longer term, you have to make the people part of the process.
Yeah. Well, again, I was talking about the culture that should be baked in the culture. If it's not part of the culture, then there's not yet trust about that process. And so, somebody new hired in, that it wasn't part of all those discussions. You can then indoctrinate them on the process of like this is the way that we do it. It's part of the culture here. They will come up to speed much more quickly than if that's not part of the culture. Then they'll fight against it. They'll say, well, we did it this way where I came
Mhm.
from, and I think it would be better. And then they start throwing, a wrench into, the way things work. Do you find though that do you struggle more, again, take it from the S&P working with clients perspective, with leadership on this kind of thinking and making these kinds of changes, or with the people down in the weeds that own these systems, the end users? Do you have
Well,
a bigger struggle with one over the other?
I mean, I guess in leadership, almost across the board, there is easier collaboration. It's also, I mean, it's less people also, right? And they are mostly on the same level. So with leadership, I find it typically easier, or my experience is that it's easier to come to an agreement, but it's all in execution later on how to basically manifest that. Many times, struggles are in communicating like decisions down the line or the way how decisions are built within the organization then that it actually then reaches the operation level. In many cases, no matter whether it's a project or any other leadership situation, leaders typically find a common agreement.
Yeah.
But to make sure that actually the whole organization is behind that, this is where it actually struggles because the change doesn't happen just that doesn't happen because somebody says it's supposed to happen, right? You need to convince people, you need to understand people, you need to actually take perspective of the people. One thing which I try to teach even my kids is take the perspective of that other person. Just put yourselves in the shoes of the other person. If there's like one thing in terms of like mental tricks that you can do, just like one thing, I think it would be that. Just try to take the perspective of that other person. How would you feel if somebody came up to you and confronted you with a decision that you either don't understand or you're not aligned with? How would you react? I mean, maybe you're obedient and you just like nod your head, but silently you either quit, right, or you rebel and you basically bring it out sometimes later. You go to the coffee corner and tell like, hey, there's stuff and change happening that I'm not really an affirmative with. So what is this all about? And then basically you have these two levels or multiple levels basically within the hierarchy that you basically need to gap. So when you take yourself into the perspective of the other person, in many cases, it's actually particularly the role that you need to take the perspective of. Always think about like, where are they right now? And many people are protective to, hey, I want to stay where I am. Change can happen, but please someplace else at best, right? So making the change easy to them typically has to do with explaining how the change is actually operationally affecting their work, right? And what's in it for me? What are the gains that you're actually seeing? Not what are the losses or the things that you have to step over to actually make that change happen in the end, but what is in it for you? Or from my perspective, then, as I'm the viewer, what's in it for me? If you're able to explain that, and yes, that may be sometimes granular work, but it goes a long way, because if you are reaching out to the right people, to multipliers in the organization that are being respected, that are being heard, you need to convince those guys. And this is typically like, I'd say like first line managers many times, right? Which have a very strong relationship to the employees that they're basically leading at this point in time, because it's typically, it's like they were one of them, right, at the time, and then they got promoted, they basically took the job. Many times they're not hired from the outside, but they're homegrown individuals, those first line managers, many times. So they have a strong fellowship, and these are the multipliers you need to basically convince, because they will then continue to do the work for you, and convince the people that that is actually a good change to make longer term, and the things considered that and maybe sometimes you need to even widen your horizon. Maybe sometimes things are not obvious, right? And at like the bubble that you're in, that change doesn't seem meaningful at all. But then it's like on you as a leader to like show them like, okay, what's a little bit greater scheme of things? Not go like 5 levels up, because that typically is too much of a distance to take, but take it like one level up, and basically make it like tangible for them. Like, okay, maybe it doesn't like benefits you right away, but you're living in an organization where you're dependent on this other person, you're dependent on this person in purchasing, right? You're dependent on this on this person in QA, and so on and so forth. It's making their lives better, and so it's making your lives better indirectly. So making sense out of this, making them understand is what you definitely need to do.
It made me think of for an adoption technique to try and bring people over. I mean, I've just never been a fan of like the generic role based adoption. Like if I'm doing a deployment in my enterprise, I've merged these systems, I'm rolling out new software on top of like all these different pieces. There's massive change that's happening. And if I do kind of generic, well, if you're a project manager and this is how you roll, like it doesn't have quite the impact as if you go and you search out who those champions, those influencers are inside the organization around these key areas, work closely with them, just as you've described, is ask those questions like, what do you actually do? Let's walk me through your day to day and how this impacted. If it looked this way, what would be the impacts? If you then build a case study, an example, and showcase actual people and their roles in that function, it has again, I use the phrase like it sticks. It people better they understand it. They are more accepting of that. They build trust quickly about that. It also develops each of those people into then advocates for this project. They're more if they're more involved, if you're using them as a case study, they're more forthcoming with feedback where they may have been holding back on, or they start to get creative. The other people then start using them as they're sharing, hey, I'm going through this is what we're talking about. Hey, did you remember this? Oh, and we also had this other need. Oh yeah, that needs to be included. Again, it's a method in adoption strategies to utilize the people that are going to be using the system, using the data,
Yeah.
which of course makes sense. That who knows the most about the system, who knows most about their experiences day to day, than the people actually using it. That's why it can't just be an IT initiative. IT enables that, but it's about the people using the system.
Absolutely. Plus, I mean, you got me thinking that, I mean, one of the things that you can actually also do, specifically in larger organizations where not everybody is knowing everybody, but there are people which are respected basically within the organization. You can build basically success cases or success stories around what they achieved, basically, specifically for round two, for wave two, and so on and so forth. Because I mean, it's just like the same as with clients. The most trust basically people have when being adopted to something new, when things seem alike. Hey, that's a person, first of all, that I trust. Hey, I know that that guy or that girl is working in the same job as I do. They basically made this achievement by adopting the change. So hey, that also seems to be good for me. Clients also always ask for references, which if you're working on by project base, you never get the perfect match, but you
Right.
get always almost like an 80%, 90% match of, hey, that is exactly your situation or almost your situation. So you can relate to actually to that. And which is like, I guess the the most distinct factor for people believing, because if they don't believe you, they will believe their peers that they respect in the end.
Right. Well, I have to ask you, like, when you're talking about managing risk and complexity in these massive projects, because that's an issue. And I came up through like the project management ranks and that side of it, where you're constantly looking at here's potential risk, here's something could happen, build a plan if this happens, here's the steps that we'll take around that. And you can, when you're dealing with executives, with stakeholders in this, that they know that, hey, what would happen if, what if this happens, what if we have this slip or this delay or this problem. And if you then say we've got a plan, we've got a mitigation strategy for that if it happens, do you see though common mistakes that companies make when they're trying to modernize their systems? I mean, are there again themes, common threads of errors that are made that you advise companies like steer clear of these things or be prepared for this? It's going to happen, it's unavoidable, but be prepared for these things.
Yeah. I mean, one of the other things that we regularly see as one cause of error is not being prepared to test the right things and validate basically and make sure that the that you basically got real business sign off, right? Testing many times still is seen as not an afterthought, but not done as throughoutly as actually being needed. So that's one of the central risks. So um, specifically when you're taking stuff from a technical angle, if you come from an IT perspective or from a bottom-up perspective, you are at the risk of underestimating what this actually means, because only your business users know what are the risky processes. What if it breaks might even kill me, but not literally, but
Yeah,
when
yeah.
right? And and what are the test cases that give me the most coverage and certainty about, hey, what I did was actually right? Because you need to, of course, strike a balance always between the invest that you do into testing, right, and the risk that you're basically trying to cover. So you better go ahead and make sure that you get the business involved in those things, which I see as like the most common risk here, and finding out what is it that you would consider relevant for sign off. When would you feel safe and when would you feel confident that what we did here did actually work in the end? So I think that's
Hmm.
one of the common threads that is typically underestimated when coming bottom up at this point.
I throw one in, just one that again had a lot of trouble with it, especially as you get more agile, you break it in, you're doing pilots with different teams, is the alignment between teams. Like here's what's working over here, and you make some assumptions that 80% is going to be the same. Say, yeah, but the 20% that's left could be critical. I mean, it's always the 80-20 rule is always at play.
Yeah,
I mean, you do the best you can, move this across, then you spend the majority of your time. It's almost a reverse of that. 80% of your time is then spent with 20% of the difficult cases to move the things across. Um, but uh, my experience is that organizations don't consider enough about making sure there's alignment between the different groups, the different stakeholders, like that side.
yeah,
Make
yeah.
sure you're
And
getting
again,
the right feedback, the right inputs when you're sharing the data, the results of that, and say, all right, let's look at the implications of this. How would this impact you?
yeah. And I mean, I can mostly take this from a perspective of development teams, even, right, where you're working on a big platform like we are constantly, basically, with what we're doing here, and teams are basically being misaligned many times about like practices, because I mean, you have devs, you have QA, you have your UX practitioners, and so on and so forth. What I found useful most of the time, that, and that's part of the culture actually, is when you build those, I don't know whether it's really a term, but basically we call them guilds, right? Where you organize people that have the same concerns and make them basically ensure that they are sharing best practices all along the way, not just in the occasion of a given project, but basically continuously. This way, of course, you're creating just more connectivity between the people that are in somewhat of the same job, but typically because of they're working on different products, right? Or they're working in different entities, let's say. They're typically not connected with each other, but they're doing the same things. You're establishing a learning culture and a culture of continuous improvement if you foster an environment that's going towards this kind of guild type of methodology. So basically, they're meeting up on a regular basis. Let's say they're meeting up like once a month. They bring in their critical cases. They bring in their success stories. They talk about their successes in the end. That's inspiring also to the other people of the group, not only learning like what were the mistakes and how did we actually overcome, but actually what was it that really went really, really well. Surprisingly, maybe sometimes, which is then inspiring the other people to maybe even be able to take another slight risk, and by that,
Right.
like being
Yeah.
advancing even faster.
I will say this. In fact, I was talking with a friend last week about this. Like, organizations don't take enough time to celebrate the wins and to recognize people, and but recognize like decisions made, like what worked well. I love at the end of projects, again, project management hat of the post-mortem, where you go back through and you talk about, but even a post-mortem at the end of that phase or the entire project, usually it focuses too much or
On the
entirely on
problems
all
that
the
they
things that
basically
went
have.
wrong and
Yeah,
not
yeah,
about what went right. Right.
yeah, yeah. And that's a common theme. And I don't know whether that's cultural. Me being German, we have a tendency of looking at things a little bit from the negative way, or what is
Yeah.
there actually to improve.
No,
But
I
you're
think
exactly right.
it's pretty global. Yeah.
Yeah. But you're right, because I mean, you're forming the culture that you're living, right? And if you are an inspiring leader and you talk about the things that went well and you celebrate success, chances are, not only chances are, certainty is that people not only find you more credible, find you also more fun, find the environment that they're working in just more fun to work with, because it's just like a positive reinforcement, right? There's basically, you when you talk like about bad things all the time, I mean, that drags you down, and
Right.
continuously you all think about like the risk that you're basically having. On the other side, if you're celebrating and basically enforce or improve your strengths rather than constantly beat on your weaknesses, when you're reinforcing your strengths, I think overall it's a better concept of improving not only individuals but the overall organization, because you will just have more people happy. And to be honest, I mean, I mean, when you look at your life, ultimately, what is there to achieve? To be happy with the people that you actually work with. And this is just like, it's so important to be in such an environment. I guess like companies which foster that are so much more successful because they have motivated people, intrinsically motivated, not extrinsically motivated, people that go the extra mile just automatically because they love it. That this goes above and beyond just that one feedback cycle that you were actually initially doing. So again, like you said, it's a cultural practice that you actually need to like, um, yeah, you need to practice that. It's not easy, specifically when you're starting from the other end of the spectrum, and many things that you're putting up in your retrospectives is negatively coined.
Yeah. What One other thing I wanted to ask you about, I know with technology uh is changing so quickly. And I mean, with all of the AI capabilities and things that are out there, how is that evolving in your space? How is that changing like what you do in the conversations that you're having with AI in the mix? Kind of broadly, what are the impacts? Like, how is it changing the way that you're having conversations with your clients?
It does. And it also changes the way of how we're having conversations with the employees, actually. Because chances are, specifically on the employee side, not so much on the customer side, but on the employee side, AI is initially seen as a threat. can it replace me, basically, right? So, I mean, it's a white collar revolution, really. And I always say AI will not replace your job, but a person using AI may replace your job. And why is that the case? Because those guys may just be a little bit more effective. So you need to use it as your advantage, to your advantage, basically. And whenever we are building AI into the product or we're building use cases, we try to never take the autonomy away from the human being, right? Either in the authoring process or in the approval process, or basically however the thing basically works. So the human always has to stay on top of the game. Plus, I always see like AI is a super valuable thing if you treat it as a consultant giving you a proposal. You always need to take the responsibility and the ownership of the actual decision. You can't go on autopilot. But if you take this type of thing, this type of approach, it can actually like enhance many of the things that you're basically doing. So, for instance, I like to get up early in the morning. I'm a morning person. All right, then nobody's there in the morning, and I don't want to bother people. I mean, I could probably be in other time zones, but I typically don't want to bother people. I still have this one idea which I would like wrap my head around, like spin. Hey, I'm spinning up an instance of ChatGPT. I'm just like going through the process and like iterating over it, having something like, well, somebody who's like challenging me. And I'm like always asking the AI to like, hey, challenge this idea. Yeah. What is it that I could be improving about that? Or what are the shortcuts that the scene? So times come, I come to the office. I already have like a prep mental model around this, like, and can discuss it with the peers even more effectively, basically. Right. On the other side, if you look at like how do you put AI into products, and I mean, co-piloting is the thing, right? With many other cases. When you think about, and we talked about projects very much, right? And projects by nature are somewhat have a services type of nature, right? And a consultancy type of nature. So, of course, chances are people are seeming threatened that AI will take their jobs and so on and so forth. But the same metaphor still applies. So if you build a co-pilot into an application, just make sure that the user is always in control of what's actually happening. Both visually, for instance, that you give an instruction, or you basically have a request, it's answering, maybe it's even executing some tool, but make it visually make it visually comprehensible for the person. So, for instance, if you're a developer and if you're in an IDE, right, and you have like the chat window on the right hand side, you want to see the code change, right? The same thing like with us within our products. When you are building up transformation objects that are there to extract data out of systems, and you basically do it via a copilot, you want to see the things change. You want to be on top of the game. You want to basically be the one who gives the final confirmation, be able to make twists and tweaks. So another thing, another metaphor when building AI into products is always keep on the iterative process of things. I know it sounds tempting to make AI a one-shot thing and it produces an end deliverable in the end. I would advise for not doing so. I would advise for always incrementally building it and giving the person who is interacting with it a chance to react, a chance to refine, just like within a collaboration with a colleague that you would have, right? You're debating about a problem, maybe you're co-developing on something, maybe you're building out a presentation or whatnot. It's about the communication that is happening there. So I think the same metaphors actually do and should apply here.
Yeah, I like the idea, and there's a lot of now that, I mean, this is a slightly different topic of what we've been going through, but the whole the creation of agents and having, you know, agents that are able to call upon other agents, that so you have like scenario specific, you know, chat bots or GPTs that are created, agents that are created that are autonomous to some degree. So they're able to, if you put in a request, it knows to go and ask these three other GPTs or agents to complete the entire task, but they do their one piece. But it's kind of like having, you know, your modular code so that you have then so yes, you have to understand the relationships and what each are going and doing, but you also have then testing and failure that happens at that module, not the whole system. And it's not this, again, it's the monolith versus we're going to go into the
modular system,
components,
the
right?
modularity.
And so I like where it seems like it's going. It's almost like the future is Zapier, you know.
It
In
is.
some
It
way.
is. I mean, at one point, and we're almost close to that, it starts to become a convenience. It's actually expected that to work this way because it just gives you that level of efficiency that well, was, something which is extraordinary like 1.5 years ago, but nowadays it's not again, right? So you actually, yeah, I think it's unavoidable that you are getting into the process as an individual, right? And think about like how you can make use out of that. But on the other side, if you're building something, again, as I said, you need to build it in a way that it is not like taking away the control from the person that's actually operating on top of that specific system. So one example would be, for instance, I did a demo last year at one of our trade shows where we had the first version of our Copilot basically built into the products, and even at that point in time, there was like two things which, for me, necessary to express was that, hey, whatever you're doing right here, you're doing it under the privileges and under the authorizations of the current user. It is just like as you did it, you're just using an alternative interface, which happens to make you more productive, more efficient, basically along the way. But it is actually you doing that
Right.
on steroids.
Well, it's funny. It goes back to what we were talking about towards the beginning, as creating a learning organization where people are constantly out. I think this is kind of the secret to the AI tools. Like, you need to be piloting, you need to be trialing, you need to then ask the question: how would I implement this more in the work that I'm doing? How does this change? Does it improve? Does it make, how can I add to the other things that I'm doing? You'll be more on top of the rest of the change that's happening. I mean, it's happening so quickly, and a lot of the ways that we're doing. And when you think of like the Chat GPT interface, where it's like an aside, a lot of the AI, it's being more and more integrated into every solution. So you're not even aware that sometimes that, okay, there's an AI component to this, other than these are web enabled features. But this is something. I mean, my advice for future leaders and employees alike is that you need to continually learn. You need to be looking at this stuff, and it's not just if you're in IT. It's like you said, it's a white collar revolution. It is information workers, modern work people, people that, even people that are remote out in the field. But if you are interfacing through device, if you're out there, I think of like utility workers that have like an iPad that they're on location, or a smart device, and they're collecting information, collaborating, interacting with the information workers back at headquarters around that. Even they need to be up on a lot of the tools, the changes, and have an opinion, have a voice in what's happening then with the systems. This is my experience, and that change, this is how it impacts me. I'm always
And
amazed that when people online and forums are complaining about whatever product it is, whatever company is, and I've started asking occasionally if it's going a certain direction. I said, have you provided this feedback back to the company that makes this product? Well, no. It's like, so they'll never know that this whole conversation is happening. Most likely, they probably have listening tools and various forums and stuff, but you need to directly take it back to them and provide that feedback. It's the same inside a company. If you're not
exactly.
speaking up,
Then yeah,
how do we
that is
collectively
your
learn?
chance to shape the future, actually, to
Right.
not just get on top by using it in this sense, but also like shaping the future. And this has never been different. So AI is really just like one of the trends that we see right now. That's basically there. But ultimately, it's the change again, right? It's the being afraid of me being left behind if I don't get on top of the game. So it's the same story again, to be honest, right?
Yeah.
So as a leader, you need to make sure that you provide a comfort level. You provide basically an entry point to, hey, what are your concerns? How can that actually affect your work positively? And then give the space to actually even try it out and be able to fail. Be able to fail. Because if you're not able to fail because you're afraid of the consequences,
Yeah.
you will not try out stuff. And that is actually what's hindering you.
Yeah.
And
That
it's funny enough that you even see it in the AI. Why does AI does such a phenomenal job in like memorizing things and all these different types of, like, I would say even creative tasks sometimes, because it's tried out millions, quadruple million times, right? Yeah, billions of times it tried that. That was the concept. Try and fail, reinforcement learning, supervised or unsupervised. That's the whole concept of the thing, basically. Yes, of course, with machines, you can do it at much faster rate than you can probably do as a human being, but the principle is exactly the same.
Yeah. I'll tell you, and I'm sure you've experienced this too. It's frustrating when you have, as a hiring manager, you bring somebody on who you can tell has had experiences in their previous work or through their career where they are, the phrase, gun shy. They're afraid to voice their opinion, to disagree with their manager or others, and be viewed as like that way. And there's, I mean, there's the opposite problem, that there's some that are a bit too generous with their feedback and
That's
dominate
true.
the discussion.
Sometimes, yeah, sometimes not
Right.
appropriate. But
You got to find a balance there. But I mean, it comes down to, if the culture of your organization is such that widespread people are afraid to voice their opinions, to try things out with fear of, if I make a mistake, even one mistake, I could lose my job, uh, then you're not going to learn as much about, and you're going to actually, I think, my experience, you're going to run into more problems, more mistakes made in that kind of organization than if you're open and transparent.
absolutely. And you typically relying then on your manager to make the decisions, to even imply then that the manager is capable of making the decisions because that guy seems to have like all of the information, which they probably don't at this point or at any point in time. So embracing change, embracing a feedback culture that is open and that is positive in the way it's how it's being enacted, I think makes a super huge difference in the velocity that the company has, in the appeal that the company has, and in the success overall. Because ultimately, it means they are willing to adopt change because of the feedback culture. I mean, that is
Right.
in the thing. That's the reason for why you give feedback, because you want to improve. And maybe it's even in the term, because improve sounds a little bit more like digestible than change does. Change has always like it's something that it's changing things that I already know. If you're improving things, that's something everybody likes. So
I,
maybe we should call it an improvement culture.
I always used it. So I'm a W. Edwards Deming fan, and it's optimize the system. You be
Yeah.
running it optimal, like, hey, we're at the highest numbers, the percentage productivity, whatever it is. How can we further optimize? So it's. I mean, he talked about Kaizen, the Japanese word for the process of continual improvement. But optimizing that, you're always going to be optimizing that. I used to joke with my kids when they were in high school and be like, "Hey, Dad, I got an A." I'm like, "How could you have done better?" And it's kind of a joke. It's like I'm not like one of those parents that was like, "You got an A, not good enough. It should have been an A+." No, but we'd always talk about that. Like, think about, what else could you do? How could you improve on that? It's a mindset. It's a cultural aspect of that. Which also then puts you in a position when change happens. So it's not that maybe you are at 99.999% effective, productive, whatever it is. Change happens. Business rules change. New people come in. The culture has some like issues because of other things. I mean, all of these different factors that will wear it down. There's always going to be opportunities to be looking for and to find ways to optimize.
Yeah, and if you take it from an empathy perspective, who may be resilient or not inviting to change, if you foster a mindset of how can I utilize this change to my own benefit, basically, what can I get out of this? If people think in the optimizing way that hey, there's a change always is a way of how you can also like tag into this thing and optimize the hell out of it in the end. So if you get this type of thinking, actually people are embracing change because it just comes natural and it always turns out, on the longer run at least, to be better than before.
Yeah.
I mean, otherwise we would probably still be sitting in caves and like eating mammoths and stuff like that. Right? If it wouldn't be for change and for like the willingness to improve, which by the way brings me to another thing. It's like one of the things that you always get people with is their own comfort level, right? Or convenience.
Yeah.
People always optimize for their own convenience, no matter what. So if you can somehow attach it to that and give it that spin, you certainly got them.
I thought you were going a different direction with that last comment, talking about mammoths. It was just in the news that they're trying to genetically bring back the mammoth,
Or
take
do
the
they?
DNA with an elephant and bring it back. So we could, in a few years, be dining on mammoth once again as humans. So
Wow,
yeah,
that would be
just
oh,
just something to think about.
yeah,
Takes a
that's
bit more effort to de-hair them to.
yeah, but on the other side, with all that wool, I mean, how much comfy like clothes can you make?
That's true. I've
Right?
got this new mammoth wool jacket. It's very comfortable.
Absolutely. It's super fancy. It's super fancy. I mean, it can headbang all by itself. It can headbang all by itself, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, Dominik,
Yeah.
I really appreciate your time and joining the podcast today. It's been a great discussion.
Super. I mean, I could just like give this back. It was super cool to be with you here. And thanks for having me. Really appreciate it very, very much.
You've been listening to the CollabTalk podcast. New episodes are published weekly, and you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcast, iHeartRadio, and most other podcast platforms. Thanks for listening.